As the nation coalesced into a more unified, identifiable country, the ambitions of those within the country grew, politically, economically, and socially. The war hawks of the early 19th century began calling for freeing Canada from the tyrannical rule of the British, which went about as well as you would expect given the similarity of the US-Canada border then and now. Economically, the innovations in transportation, communication, and regulation caused the United States to begin shifting into producing goods rather than just shipping off resources to Europe. Socially, women and American Indians began to try to gain greater liberties within society, which, like for the Warhawks, didn't go as well as they hoped, especially for the Indians. Jackson. The War of 1812 is generally regarded as one of the strangest and ultimately pointless wars of its time. So it doesn't even have significance to make up for the fact that the War of 1812 went from 1812 to 1814. It must have been that confusion that also caused the most famous American victory in the war to happen in 1815. However, while the war itself was rather pointless, no territory changed hands. And now the US had to build a whole new White House. There were lasting impacts from the war, though. After Jefferson had downsized the military and navy, most experts would guess that Congress might be a little hesitant about going into war. But not the Warhawks, led by Henry Clay, who famously wanted Canada. Through a combination of factors, namely bad tactics, insufficient forces, and the fact that the Canadians did not flock to join the US side in the war like the Warhawks said they would, the Canadian front went badly, to say the least. In the meantime, the British captured Washington, D.C. and famously burnt down the White House. Now imagine what the British could have done if they hadn't been fighting Napoleon at the same time. At sea, though, the U.S. had success, namely the USS Constitution's victory, earning it the nickname Old Ironsides. What, therefore, was gained from the war? Well, the British stopped supporting the American Indians in the U.S. West, mostly because the leader Tecumseh had been defeated during the war, and the U.S. gained more recognition internationally. In a way, then it feels like the U.S. had won because of those factors. The Battle of New Orleans and the fact that the British stopped impressing American sailors. The American Indians, though, were obviously losers for their territory loss and the loss of British support, but also because of the significance a certain military figure would gain from the war, Andrew Jackson, whose history with the Indians will continue in another video. While the US did not gain Canada from the war, they gained more than any military expert would have expected them to gain from the outset of the war. And I don't just mean the national anthem. What now is there to discuss, though, since the next American war wouldn't occur until the 1980s? The answer is economics. After the War of 1812 began, the period called the Era of Good Feelings started. During this period, the economy boomed, and occasionally busted, but mostly boomed. There were several factors that brought about this economic prosperity, called the Market Revolution. First came in the realm of transportation, as government-funded roads began to appear to help traverse the Appalachian Mountain Trail, connecting burgeoning states such as Ohio with the major ports of New York and Boston. However, these roads would soon be left behind in use with two important innovations, one being Fulton's steamboat, and the second being the canal system. Neither of these achievements would have been nearly as impactful without the other, but the canals enabled greater inland travel, setting up cities alongside the river to connect the more rural farmers or artisans to the greater metropolises on the eastern seaboard. The steamboat was also faster than horses and didn't need to be fed oats and grain. It became the most efficient method of transporting goods. The most well-known and probably the most significant of the canals was the Erie Canal, finished in 1825, which connected New York City with the Great Lakes. Steamboats also sped up travel on the Mississippi, making cities such as New Orleans and Chicago grow. The transportation innovation did not end with government-funded roads, steamboats, and canals, though, as the beginning of the newest wave of faster travel began with the construction of railroads. The first major line, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, Railroad, better known to those who play Monopoly as the B&O Railroad, began construction in 1828. Railroads didn't take over for boats with regards to transporting goods, though, for a little while. But the steps for that transition were already in place, just as the canals were shaping up. As these ways of transporting goods went up, another system started changing the way we communicate: the telegraph. No more battles after the war ended. Communication was now faster than ever before, and could traverse just as much distance as trains could. With these massive projects going up, though, reliance on banks and loans began rocketing up, bringing greater capital to the business centers in New York and other major cities. Along with this rise in big business came Supreme Court decisions defending the rights of companies, and also trying to encourage competition because monopolies are inefficient for the market. The government encouraged competition and industrialization, and as a result, the U.S. economy began to boom. The textile industry also became competitive worldwide, first off with the cotton gin increasing cotton production in the South. See, economic progress wasn't just for the North. Now, if only they could have worked on that social progress too. In response, new factories were set up in the North, especially in New England, with the most famous example being the town of Lowell, Massachusetts. This rapid transition of livelihood also caused increased urbanization as people were no longer working from home anymore. Increased immigration from Ireland and Germany gave these new factories a steady new workforce, and if they didn't have immigrants to exploit, the young farm girls who were income supplements to their families would do. Socially, several marginalized groups began to assume greater power, or at least attempted to do so during this time period. Women began working in much larger numbers, though of course it's hard to call this real progress, as the reason they were brought into work is because they could be paid a pittance. Politically, women's rights activists began to organize in greater numbers. There would still be time before the famous conference at Saratoga Springs, but the beginnings of a stronger movement than previously seen were evident. In addition, in the Capitol, future First Lady Dolly Madison began hosting events where men and women could come together to talk politics. While the women still had no official say in elections and the like, the fact that they were conversing about politics increased their political stature. These were, however, mostly wives of congressmen and senators, and were thus the upper echelon socially. But progress is progress, even when it's not enough. In addition, the Massachusetts Mill Girls, those troublemakers, organized one of the largest strikes of the time. Though it was, unfortunately, unsuccessful, that political mobility was impressive for any working group of the time, immigrants or women. Another marginalized group, the American Indians, began to gain greater respect and prominence, or at least some did. The Cherokee in the South had begun copying certain practices of Southern white citizens. They practiced animal husbandry, had farms, and in some cases plantations with slaves, adopted a written language which they used to produce a constitution. All in all, the Cherokee were becoming more and more like Europeans, or at least in certain ways. These changes, though, alarmed some, and the slavery part especially rankled the North, whose abolitionist sentiment was growing at the time. The North didn't need to fear long, though, that the American Indians would be assimilated into Southern culture. One, because the Southerners wanted the American Indian land, and two, because the Indian Removal Act was soon to happen. Lastly, the religious movement known as the Second Great Awakening brought even greater religious fervor to the U.S. In connection, women's roles under Republican motherhood of greater domestic importance gained a religious tone. Northern preachers began again to convert, or at least to try to convert, American Indians, and backlash against Irish immigrants, because they were Catholic, became more prevalent. Another case of anti-Catholicism that would extend into the next war, the Mexican-American War. But before that comes the Jacksonian era. With the new era of peace, the U.S. enjoyed greater economic prosperity, while marginalized groups gained hope for new promising movements in the United States. The ideology of the land of opportunity appealed again to the European countries suffering during this period, especially Ireland and, well, not exactly Germany, since Germany didn't exist at this point, but the Germans living in the Holy Roman Empire. The new ideas of industry, encapsulating Alexander, you won in the end even though you died before you could see it, Hamilton's vision, became realized, and the ambition of Americans, which had once gone towards Canada, now spread out to the west. Louisiana, Oregon, the Pacific Ocean, and some Mexican territories now lay ahead as America's manifest destiny. Hope you learned something and enjoyed the video.